Hi, no matter what the screen just said, this is History 3380, World Civilizations. This is the second part of session 4. In the first part, we were looking at epidemic disease in the ancient and early modern world. And one of the major themes there was the transition from ancient times when, yes, epidemic disease did hit and ravage areas like the Roman Empire, etc., and the early modern world, where once again epidemic diseases erupted, but now with far greater consequences because of things like improved transportation, the rise of the Mongol Empire. That meant there were long land-based trade routes that were now securely administered. The improvements in transportation and commerce meant at the same time that they became facilitators of the spread of disease. So whereas disease was usually limited to a single political entity in the past, by the time of the early modern world, we were experiencing pandemics, where epidemic diseases like the Black Death could spread over much of the populated world, if not most of it. What we're going to look at today primarily is an area of the world that was not affected back in the 14th century by the Black Death. In fact, it lived, if you will, in sort of splendid isolation during much of recorded history down to about 1492 and the coming of Columbus. And that, of course, is the Americas. And we're going to look at the impact of epidemic disease there as well and look at some of its consequences, just as we saw certain changes that came about in Europe as a result of epidemic disease. But we're going to look at the same kind of thing in the Americas. We're also going to look at modern pandemics, particularly the flu epidemic, which broke out right after World War I and killed tens of millions of people around the globe. And then we'll briefly look as well at least the prospects of avian flu or other such pandemics that might break out in the contemporary world and how things are either similar or different than they were, let's say, 500 years ago. But we're certainly seeing how epidemic disease can have profound effects on civilizations, how things changed in Europe with a weakening of feudal systems, a weakening of the Christian church, the weakening of the city-states like Genoa that dominated the Mediterranean, leading to a creation of a power vacuum there. Now we're going to turn to the Americas and see some similar consequences. What we're also going to see is that in the case of the Western Hemisphere, the effects of pandemics were far more severe. 90% of the population of the Western Hemisphere would disappear in the course of 150 years as a result of epidemic disease. The greatest epidemiological catastrophe in the history of mankind. So if we look at the first slide, we're going to start briefly by going back to the Europeans, because it's their fault for all of this. As the Black Death visited and revisited Europe into the 18th century, mortality rates declined, as I suggested, because in part surviving generations were those who had at least some innate immunity to such a disease, and because diseases themselves tend to mutate over time. It's somewhat similar to what happens with human beings. Versions of the disease that quickly kill the host tend not to survive themselves. You know, if you're a certain kind of microbe or virus, you get into a human and you kill the human within 24 hours. Well, you're not going to spread very far because now the host is dead. If the host survives for a while, then you've got a chance, you know, that the virus can, or the bacteria can be spread to other people. There are epidemic diseases like this that can cause severe but very brief outbreaks, because what they do is they kill the entire population which is exposed to them, so it's very unlikely that the disease is going to spread. So what happens with diseases is those strains that are less fatal in their effects tend to survive over time, so oftentimes the strains of epidemic diseases that are passed on from generation to generation tend to be less deadly. Now, the Black Death was not the only disease that the Europeans encountered as an epidemic during these centuries. In other words, during early modern times. In addition to the plague, or the Black Death, there was also smallpox and influenza. It's not that these weren't around in previous centuries, it's just that they revisited Europe and other parts of the world. And as these epidemics do strike again in Europe and Asia and Africa, they are more intense and widespread for the same reason that the Black Death was so pervasive in its influence, because again, transportation, commerce are improving, the speed of movement between different societies is increasing, and that means it's easier to spread these types of diseases. What will also happen now is that Europeans, who are seething with all kinds of diseases, influenza, smallpox, the plague, various sexually transmitted diseases, Europeans, by the 15th century, are starting to reach out and explore other parts of the world, particularly in long ocean-going voyages. The Portuguese moving down the coast of Africa and eventually on into Asia. The Spanish moving west across the Atlantic to the Americas. And as the Europeans move out, they are carrying these diseases with them. Now, in most instances, the fact that the Europeans are, full right to the brim with various deadly microbes doesn't have a significant consequence in most of the places they visit. As the Portuguese inch their way along the coast of Africa and then on to the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent and finally China, the fact is they're mostly visiting populations which have already been exposed to many of these diseases in recent centuries. So the impact is going to be minimal. If anything, it was the Europeans who were at risk in these areas, because as they moved into tropical climates, as they moved below the equator, of course, they were moving into areas where particularly bacterial diseases could flourish, and there were oftentimes bacterial diseases of a tropical nature that they had not been exposed to. So it was the Europeans actually in these ventures who were more at risk of dying from some type of disease. But as they went west, as the Spanish crossed the Atlantic, believing the silly idea of Columbus that the world was only about 7,500 miles in diameter, as they did this, they were going to be exposing a very different kind of population. What I call here the biological innocence of the Americas. Populations which for thousands of years had been isolated away from the spread of epidemic disease that had touched virtually the rest of the populated world. So these people are not going to have the built-in immunities that other human beings had, because they haven't had that same epidemiological experience. As far as people in the Americas go, we think they came to the Americas around 25,000 years before the beginning of the contemporary era. So math says 27,000 years ago, roughly. We think that people migrated across the eastern portions of the Asian continent into North America, essentially moving from what today would be Russia across the Bering Straits to Alaska. Except at the time they did this, around 25,000 before the contemporary era, there were no Bering Straits. There was a land bridge connecting Asia to North America. This had to do with the height of the ocean. Okay? Got a cold climate, moisture is being sucked up into ice formations, sea levels decline, and there's a land bridge. Later on, when the Earth's climate warms, more water, sea levels rise, land bridge disappears. But in the meantime, for these people, it was possible to cross by foot, some of them came by boat, and enter into North America. And gradually, these populations moved down and settled much of the Western Hemisphere. In other words, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Central America, South America, that whole region. Now, obviously, populations densities varied tremendously, whether you were talking about the northern reaches of North America versus, let us say, the eastern coast and central Mexico, the South American Andes. In each of these areas, population densities would vary considerably, as we will see. But one thing that was true is that, well, I said that these people lived in splendid isolation. It wasn't entirely splendid. In other words, they weren't living in a microbial vacuum. In fact, there were diseases, naturally, that existed among these human populations. Things like tuberculosis, dysentery, syphilis, we think. There's all kinds of debates over sexually transmitted diseases and whether one originated in the Western Hemisphere, one originated in Europe. Doesn't make any difference to us. But we know that there were diseases that were common to these populations that we see in the rest of the world. But the fact is, they were not being exposed to things like the plague, smallpox, cholera, influenza. These did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. And since the land bridge was gone and few people would venture across the oceans, there was almost no exposure by this population. You think about it, they came around 25,000 before the contemporary era. They probably reached the southern tip of South America about 12,000 before the contemporary era. And by that point, we're talking about 12,000 years, almost, that these people live in the Western Hemisphere and are simply cut off from what's going on in the rest of the world. So this population really has virtually no built-in immunity to these diseases because they haven't been exposed to these repeated epidemics that strike most of the rest of the populated world. Now again, they lived in diverse environments. If you think about the woodlands of northeastern North America, the plains of central North America, the highland regions of South America. You go from tropical climates to temperate climates, dry mountain climates. So environmental diversity was the order of the day. And as we will see, that will have some effect on how disease spreads in the Western Hemisphere as well. Now, how many people there were in the Western Hemisphere, again, is a matter of debate. 25 million is probably a pretty good estimate, although estimates have varied from 5 million to 50 million. But around 25 million is probably a good estimate. So we're looking at around 25 million people living in the Western Hemisphere just prior to the time of the coming of Columbus. And then Columbus comes. He enters in the Caribbean on a series of exploratory ventures, finds various islands, such as the island of Cuba, which he tries to pass off as Japan to make the king and queen of Spain happy, because he told them he was headed for Asia, so he figured he'd better find Asia. Well, it looked like Japan. I don't know. Okay, so everybody was wearing a loincloth. I thought it was a Buddhist ceremony. He basically tried to pretend that he was encountering the regions that he thought he was going to find, which in fact, of course, lay thousands and thousands of miles further to the west. These early voyages don't seem to have a major impact in terms of disease. The very earliest exchanges seem to have been relatively insignificant in terms of disease. That probably is determined by the fact that there were 3 ships coming. We're talking about a few hundred individuals, initial contacts that did not last terribly long, and therefore the first encounters were sufficiently limited in intensity and numbers, and probably to limit the potential for the spread of disease. But as the years went by, as we go through the 1490s, more Spaniards are showing up, staying, living cheek by jowl with the local inhabitants. Now disease spread starts to mount, particularly influenza and dysentery. Now you say, well, you just said a couple of minutes ago that they had dysentery in the Western Hemisphere before these people came. Why would it have such an effect? Because it's a different variety. Their dysentery is different from our dysentery. These diseases would take a mounting toll on the major settlement that the Spanish had made up to this point on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Hispaniola is where the modern nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. We think that when Columbus showed up in 1492, there may have been 500,000 people living on the island. It's a lot. We think by 1518, they were all dead. That's a lot. Even if you say 25 years, but 25 years, you've totally depopulated the island of its indigenous inhabitants. If there were any left, their numbers were so small, they simply weren't being recorded. And the Spanish were very good about recording numbers at this point because one of the things they did, of course, is force the indigenous population to pay tribute. So you had to make sure you had the heads counted so you could collect the tribute. And there were no longer enough heads to make it worthwhile to even bother counting anymore by 1518. So virtually the entire population has been destroyed. Now, in 1518, smallpox begins to spread in the Caribbean, and as we will see, will soon reach the mainland, followed by influenza. And very soon, what will happen is that there will be this sort of vicious cycle of epidemics. Influenza, dysentery, smallpox, plague, one following another. And oftentimes it's hard to separate the strands to figure out, okay, well, which epidemic are we talking about where? And sometimes there were two epidemics going on at the same time. That people were dying of influenza and dysentery, or influenza and smallpox in the same region. So you've got this sort of wild outburst of epidemic disease that starts to take place in the populations of the Caribbean and then gradually on the mainland. Now, it spreads to the mainland because the Spanish are looking for valuable resources, particularly silver and gold. They find little of that on the Caribbean islands. So they're less interested in those islands than they are in the mainland. The islands are important because they provide ports, they provide jumping off points for returning to Europe, etc. But the real goal of the Spanish is to find silver and gold. And they are told that there are great empires on the mainland that possess those resources. Two Spanish conquerors, Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizzaro, will be the main vectors, the main carrying forces of disease onto the mainland. As they go looking for those treasures, as they go looking for those powerful empires, they will carry with them that disease, or those sets of diseases, I should say. Now, it's not just the Spanish, because as we will see, epidemic disease started to strike at some of the mainland empires before the Spanish ever showed up. Again, we seem to have this invisible army marching before the Europeans. But what's happening instead is simply this, that of course there were a variety of indigenous societies and civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, and they traded with each other. The great Inca Empire in South America had trade routes that ran up into Central America, into the Caribbean. The Aztec Empire of Mexico had trade routes that ran into Central America, into the Caribbean, and well into North America, into the southern parts of what is today the United States. So these indigenous merchants are carrying goods from the Caribbean, which is now infested with these European-born diseases. So the indigenous populations are carrying the diseases themselves even before the Europeans get a chance to intervene in the affairs of these land-based empires. And again, human knowledge, we may be talking, almost a century after the outbreak of the Black Death, but human knowledge of epidemic disease is still pitifully small. So it's not as if, you know, the indigenous populations are going to say, oh, yeah, right, of course, we don't want to move around because we'll spread epidemics. It's just going to happen just like it happened with the Black Death. So the invisible armies are already on the march, and they're already affecting these land-based empires. For Cortés, his goal is the Aztec Empire of Mexico, centered in its capital city of Tenochtitlan, which was located on precisely the same site as modern-day Mexico City. Mexico City was built on the ruins of the Aztec capital. He lands his forces at a bay that he dubs Veracruz, or the True Cross, and then begins marching inland. Now, Cortés had certain advantages. His force was very small. We're talking about a couple hundred people. He does manage to secure some Indian allies to assist him, people who want to revolt against the Aztecs. And, of course, he has metal weapons that the Aztecs do not have access to. But beyond that, the most critical element was disease. The first time that Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan, or the Aztec capital, they barely escaped with their lives. In fact, some of them didn't. The Aztecs, of course, were not very friendly about being conquered by others. And when the Spanish tried to do that, they kind of got upset. So the Spanish had to beat a hasty retreat, barely escaped. They returned a year later, in 1521, and now they are able to overrun the city. Again, with a relatively small group of Spanish soldiers aided by some Indian allies. The difference was that a smallpox epidemic had broken out in the capital, and it killed 100,000 people. It had absolutely decimated the leadership of the Aztec Empire. As a result, conquest would be so much easier because of this mounting disaster. Leaders were dying, people who were responsible for maintaining order, for transporting goods. The bodies are piling up so fast, they can't even clear them from the streets. This is hardly a society that will be capable of organizing a stout defense in the face of the new Spanish challenge because of the devastating effects of disease. A bit more eerie was the experience of Francisco Pizzaro, the Spanish conqueror, who traveled along the Pacific coast of South America, searching for another fabled empire, the Inca Empire. And Pizzaro landed in 1532 on the Pacific coast of what is modern-day Peru, and began to march inland. But the events that were about to unfold had already been influenced before Pizzaro ever set off on his expedition. The ruling Inca, the emperor of the empire, in the years just before Pizzaro's arrival, was named Huayna Capac. And Huayna Capac was the latest in a series of powerful and enterprising rulers who had helped spread the Incas' influence and control along most of the Pacific coast of South America. They had an empire that stretched for several thousand miles along the coast. However, sometime between 1526 and 1528, oftentimes we settle on the date 1527, though we're not positive, Huayna Capac died, as did his chosen successor, the son that he had chosen to succeed him in power. Almost certainly, he and his son died of epidemic disease. Probably smallpox, though we're not positive of that. but we're talking the 1520s. This means that Columbus had shown up in the Caribbean 30 years before. There have now been 3 decades in which epidemic disease ravaged the Caribbean, and human agents, indigenous traders, were carrying goods from the Caribbean down into South America, and now the consequences were being felt. The significance of this event, the death of Awanacapac from an epidemic disease, is that it then left 2 sons to contend for power. One of them, Huasca, essentially seized control of the empire and tried to imprison his brother, Atahualpa, so that he could secure power for himself. Atahualpa, however, managed to escape and organized a resistance against his brother. By 1531, the Inca Empire is torn by civil war as these 2 men struggle for power. In 1532, Atahualpa has essentially emerged victorious. He's in the northern reaches of the empire, near a town called Cajamarca. He's preparing to march south and complete his conquest of his empire when the Spanish arrive. So what epidemic disease has done, before the Spanish ever showed their faces, was to create a crisis in the empire and trigger a highly destructive civil war. Once again, epidemic disease is going to work entirely in the favor of the Spanish, creating a crisis situation within the empire, creating disorder and destruction just at the time that the Spanish arrive. Now, Atahualpa was quite confident of his position. He's invited to visit Cajamarca by the Spanish. He rides in on a sedan chair with thousands of his followers, and he's invited to dine with the Spanish. And then suddenly they attack his entourage, and they seize the Inca emperor. And they drive off his followers with their weapons. And then they tell Atahualpa that he must pay them a ransom by filling a room, at least the size of this one, with gold, which his followers do to pay this ransom. And then the Spanish killed Atahualpa. But of course, they let him convert to Christianity first. Then they killed him. From here, the empire would rapidly unwind. The Spanish would drive south, seize the entire imperial system. One of their major advantages was the civil war that broke out prior to their arrival because of epidemic disease, and then the growing effects of epidemic disease spreading through the empire, and as with the Aztecs, creating disorder on top of that already spawned by the Civil War. So again, epidemic disease has played a critical role in the conquest of these regions by the Spanish. Now, those are the 2 major political events influenced by epidemic disease in the Western Hemisphere. But the travail of the populations of the Western Hemisphere was not over by any stretch of the imagination. As I mentioned earlier, waves of disease kept spreading through the regions. In the 1530s, measles epidemics broke out in much of the Americas. Now, survival rates varied in different parts of the Western Hemisphere. As you might expect, in the lowland areas, which tended to be warmer, more humid, the effects of disease were far more widespread and serious. Mortality rates were high. In the Highlands, survival rates tended to be higher than in the lowlands. Why? A dry, cool climate often inhibited the spread of disease. So we do have variations in the rate at which people died, just as in Europe with the Black Death, we see that different areas, in that case depending on population concentration, but also on climate, help determine where the die-off would be greatest and where it would be somewhat more limited. In Mexico City in 1545, or I should say really all of Mexico, typhus or pneumonic plague, we're not sure which, broke out and delivered another major blow to the populations in the region of Mexico. A little over a decade later, smallpox again sweeps through the Inca Empire. So what we're getting is wave after wave of epidemic disease. The concentrated nature of this, the fact that it's coming so swiftly and so repeatedly, is again a reflection of the fact that in Europe at least, some portions of the population, even when the Black Death showed up, had been exposed, in prior centuries, let's say 200, 300, 400 years before. We know that plague had struck the Roman Empire. So at least back 600 or 700 years before the plague hit Europe, there were generations of people that had been exposed to it, and those with some resistance would have passed those genes on. Here, in the Western Hemisphere, we're dealing with people who, certainly for 12,000 years or more, have had no exposure. So the chance that any significant proportion of the population is carrying any kind of plague-resistant or disease-resistant gene in terms of diseases carried by Europeans is highly unlikely. And that's reflected in these repeated episodes. It's not one disease, it's a variety of diseases, and they keep coming one after the other and repeating themselves. The 1600s, the 17th century, are a continuing story of the same thing. Wave after wave of epidemic disease. And unlike Europe, at least in the early stages, within a relatively short time after the Black Death first starts striking Europe, within 50 years or so, you start to see a diminution in mortality rates. But in the Americas, that was not happening. Mortality rates were, if anything, mounting. Part of the problem is that the first impact was so bad, killed so many people, that it had an enormous effect on food supply. The Spanish themselves would report of riding through valleys and regions, provinces. And, well, there were animals in the fields. There were no human beings. Everyone was dead. It was as if a cloud of radiation had spread through vast regions of the Western Hemisphere and killing every human being in its path. With that kind of depopulation going on, food production is bound to disintegrate. The reliance in terms of food was primarily on vegetation, corn or maize, similar products, various forms of squashes, potatoes. If there's no one in the fields to harvest those products, people aren't going to be fed. And if famine is sweeping through the region, at the same time epidemic diseases, you're getting a similar but even more drastic version of what happened in Europe when famine was starting to mount just as the Black Death showed up. Something else that's spreading the diseases rapidly is the fact that the Spanish have set themselves on a course of mass conversion of the population to Christianity. Looking at a population of perhaps 25 million people, they're going to go out and they want to convert all of these people from what the Spanish considered to be their, heathen and devilishly inspired religions to Christianity. Now, to do that, one of the things that they did was to gather large numbers of indigenous inhabitants together so that they could more easily be attended to by the Christian priests. Worst thing that could have happened, of course, because you're gathering people together in concentrations. If disease is spread through, it's decimated the population, it's reduced population density. Okay, if that is the situation, then the next time epidemic disease spreads through a couple of years later, it won't be as devastating because the concentration of population has been diminished. But what the Spanish are doing is reversing that natural order, not intending to do this harm, but in order to convert people and to see that they had regular Christian instruction, they're gathering together those reduced populations into concentrated areas. And of course, when disease strikes again, now you've got another concentration of population. Now you're going to get high mortality rates once again. By 1650, the population decline, the demographic disaster, as it's been known, had reached its maximum stage. 90% of the population of the Western Hemisphere had disappeared. It's hard to imagine the enormity of what happened. And if you think of the United States, let's say it's got 400 million people, and then you look around and there are only 40 million left. What would the world look like under those circumstances? Well, this is exactly what happened in the Americas over the course of 150 years. The turnaround comes about 1650. We don't know exactly that date, but it's a convenient date. It's a nice round number. One obvious reason is now the population of indigenous inhabitants is so low that it's much harder to spread disease. Some degree of immunity has now begun to develop. We're down to the last 10% of the population who may have some degree of natural immunity. And as I suggested early on, there is the issue of disease mutation. We don't know a lot about this, but we think this is happening, meaning the diseases themselves are modifying those versions that have lower mortality rates are the ones that are likely to strike again and again because they don't immediately kill their hosts. In the aftermath of this demographic disaster, the Spanish were depicted as savage destroyers of the Native American population. Other Europeans, the British love to pick on the Spanish for this, reveled in what was called the Black Legend. Now, it's not to say that the Spanish were innocent of all this. They did treat the indigenous populations with extreme cruelty. But unlike the British colonists in North America, who deliberately set out to spread epidemic disease among some Native Americans, because they figured, well, you know, we got to get rid of these people. The Spanish had no desire to diminish the populations in the Americas because they wanted to use these populations for labor, to work the mines and the fields, etc. But nevertheless, because of the drastic drop in population in these regions, and of course, population density was much higher in places like Mexico and the Inca Empire than it was in North America, given the density of the population and how far it declined in 150 years, the Spanish, for centuries after that, would be seen as these barbaric destroyers of the Native American populations of the Americas. Now, in terms of consequences, with death rates running so high, with a loss of all but 10% of the indigenous population, changes were going to be radical. One of the changes is that the demographic patterns of the Western Hemisphere were fundamentally altered for all time. In 1492, If we look from Mexico down through South America, there are a variety of indigenous populations, civilizations, Inca, Aztec, Maya, etc. But those were the only ethnic linguistic groups there were. By 1650, that whole picture had been changed dramatically. For one thing, in the Caribbean was virtually totally depopulated of indigenous inhabitants. The people that were there to greet Columbus were no more. The Spanish, to deal with the loss of population, had been importing tens of thousands of African slaves. So an entirely new population base emerged in the Caribbean. You go to islands like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, wherever you go in the Caribbean, you're not seeing the populations or the descendants of those who lived on these islands back in 1492. You're seeing the results of an enormous African diaspora of tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people who were brought to the Caribbean by force in order to repopulate it. And they create, of course, their own culture. So you have this vibrant Afro-Creole culture, as it's known, in the Caribbean, which is a product, ultimately, of this epidemic disaster. Also, in certain parts of the Americas, a new force emerged demographically, consisting of people who were the descendants of intermarriage between Spaniards and indigenous inhabitants. People known as Mestizos. Mexico is a classic example of this, where much of the population are people who are descendants of this interlinking between indigenous peoples and the Spaniards, just Europeans in general. So you have a whole new ethnic group emerging with its own distinctive culture. And even though the indigenous population will increase in numbers once again, it's the mestizo population that remains the dominant ethnic factor in Mexico and some other societies. Elsewhere, if we go to Peru, the indigenous population, which did not suffer as severe a demographic decline because so many of them were living in the highlands, there the resurgence of population means that the population, the largest element of the population, is once again descendants of the original indigenous inhabitants. So we have very different population compositions from one place to another, depending upon the death rate, depending upon whether the Spanish brought in African slaves to replace the lost population. At the same time, despite these disasters, the culture of indigenous inhabitants has survived in virtually every Latin American society, wherever we had dense population concentrations to begin with before 1492. Mexico, Central America, Peru, Ecuador. Even today, you see these cultural survivals, whether it's in religious ideas, whether it's in language. For example, if you travel in the South American Andes, you'll hear radio stations, people are speaking Quechuan, Aymara, the languages of the indigenous populations that predated the conquest. So there are enormous survivals from the past, despite the demographic disaster. Now, one other change that occurred that would be significant, and we'll see more of this a little bit later on when we talk about empires. When the Spanish first came, they relied on a labor system known as Encomienda, a system that they had practiced long before their arrival in the New World. And essentially what it meant was that conquerors were assigned groups of Indians who then had to work for the conqueror. That was the Encomienda. That here, there's a village of 3,000 Indians. They must work for you. work the mines, work land for you, etc. And it was a system that worked fairly well at first when there was a plentiful population. But as the die-off accelerates through the 1500s, it becomes less and less practical to assign entire villages or large groups of inhabitants to individuals for their exploitation. Instead, what emerges is large landed estates known as haciendas that often rely on the raising of cattle and sheep, etc., for their economic activity. Because haciendas, large estates, could be worked with less labor, something that was essential in the absence of dense populations. So even the fundamental economic institution of Latin America, the landed estate, is in some ways a product of the demographic disaster that struck between approximately 1500 and 1650. Now, what we've looked at are two major pandemic experiences. One, the Black Death across Eurasia, and particularly in Europe. And then secondly, the spread of a variety of diseases in the Americas brought by Europeans, and of course having enormous mortality rates because of the lack of exposure to epidemic diseases in the Americas for thousands of years before the Europeans came. Epidemic diseases would diminish in significance in the centuries that follow. By the time we get to the 18th century, epidemic disease and its impact is rapidly diminishing in both Europe and in the Americas. Yeah, there are outbreaks of plague, and of course, we all know this influenza keeps showing up time and again. But levels of mortality have been radically diminished. And this is in no small measure as a result of repeated exposure to such diseases among populations across the face of the earth. That ensures that succeeding generations carry some degree of natural immunity. The mutation of disease, also very important. At one time, for example, syphilis was almost guaranteed death. Death rates were almost 100%. But over time, the disease is mutated, so if it's left untreated, you'll go crazy. Yeah, you'll go bonkers, like Al Capone, he had it. Wound up crazy as a loon. But it's unlikely to kill you. A third factor, in addition to increased natural immunity, mutation of disease, was the fact that as we get into the 19th century especially, state systems, modern states, are taking measures to deal with public health issues. Probably the most important ones involve sanitation in urban areas, especially the protection of water systems, drinkable water. This helps radically reduce deaths from dysentery. And then later, as we get into the later part of the 19th and early 20th century, we start to get into an era where science is developing vaccines to deal with various epidemic diseases as well. So there is a period by the 19th century where people are thinking, well, you know, we can handle anything. And they're very confident that modern science can deal with any future threat because we now have the tools at our command. We know what's necessary in terms of safe drinking water, healthy food, and of course, whatever vaccines may be necessary. But in fact, most of the success was due to, shall we say, natural causes in the sense of the development of immunity among succeeding generations and the mutation of disease. That fact was going to be brought home painfully to the modern world after World War I. If we look at the next slide, you'll see that just at a time when many people thought that the great pandemics of the past were just that, a thing of the past, suddenly a massive pandemic broke out across the modern world in the aftermath of World War I. It was the influenza epidemic that struck in 1918 and 1919. estimates of the number of dead run between 20 and 40 million people. Other estimates put it as high as 50 million or more. It's probably a reasonable guess that just in the Indian subcontinent, 20 million people may have died in the influenza epidemic. Now, the problem with counting is simply that in many places, so many people are dying, it's impossible to keep count. You know, who's keeping count? We're busy just trying to bury these people. And it's also a question of, okay, you know, who do we count? Did you really die of influenza? Or well, you already had a heart condition, you were gone anyways. But mostly it was a problem with people, so many people dying. It was very difficult. The whole focus was on trying to save the living rather than worrying about precisely how many people had actually expired from the disease. But the mortality rate across the globe was about 2.5%, which was extremely high for influenza. Influenza by this time was sort of what we understand influenza to be. You know, that, okay, every winter it comes, and they didn't have shots at that time, but basically, yeah, some people will die, but it's usually people who are elderly, maybe young children if they contract it, but most people are simply going to, you know, suffer some severe symptoms of muscle aches and that high fever, but then they'll recover and resume their normal activities. But suddenly, this particular strain of influenza spread across the globe and had devastating consequences for the larger population. Now, its spread can be understood from a number of factors. One, the war was ending, and large numbers of troops were in movement, returning from the war in Europe, back to places like India, the United States. In addition, there were mass movements of people because of the dislocations of the war. Inevitably, far more civilians are impacted in modern warfare than our military forces. People have been left homeless, they've been driven out of the regions in which they had lived for some time, or they've been uninhabitable, they have to return to them. The Russian Revolution had broken out in 1917, Russia was enveloped in civil war, there was massive disruption there. So we have large movements of populations all occurring at the same time. Furthermore, we have the wonders of modern transportation, that human beings are able to move vast differences in very large numbers. In the past, that just didn't happen. I mean, if you think about, if we jump back to the 1500s, let us say, yeah, people were moving on ships across the oceans in ways that they had never done before, but how many of them were moving? You know, a few hundred here, a few hundred there. There was a famous expedition by a Chinese admiral. He had perhaps 10,000 people in his expedition, but that was exceptional, that 10,000 people would be involved in an ocean-going expedition. We're talking about a handful of people here and there who were moving around. Now we have huge steamships that carry large numbers of passengers in addition to the cargo, and more than that, we have a railroad network that now counts in hundreds of thousands of miles the trackage that exists across India, across China, across Russia, Europe, South America, Africa, the United States. Now large numbers of people can move around very rapidly. And that means, again, that disease is going to spread with great rapidity because you've got large numbers of people moving rapidly. And there is very little you can do to stem these movements. You know, we're going to tell the troops, so you can't come home, you know, or people in Eastern Europe who were driven out by the war, oh no, you have to stay here at the border. Yeah, right. And they're going to move rapidly. And you're not going to be able to test all of them. You know, if you get 2,000 people on a train, you're going to stop and check each one of them, you know, check their temperature. That's what they were doing with avian flu recently. You know? Stick a thermometer in everybody's mouth at the airport, and you can't fly if your temperature's over, you know, 98.6 or something. Now, if you're at a railroad station in, let's say, 1918, and there are 2,000 people on the train waiting to go, and everybody get out and put a thermometer in their mouths, you just can't do that. The numbers are too staggering. We can understand, between transportation, the end of the war, population disruptions, how the disease could move so quickly. But perhaps the most confounding aspect of this modern pandemic was the mortality rate. Why did so many people die of influenza when influenza had been around for centuries upon centuries, when influenza was no more of a threat to the human population back in 1917 than it would be, let us say, in the contemporary era, where again it's a matter of, well, you might get sick and be uncomfortable for a while, but that's it. Even today, modern scientists are not sure why this particular strain of influenza proved to have such a high mortality rate. It seems certain that some kind of mutation had occurred. In fact, influenza virus, basically, as you probably know, mutates or modifies itself virtually every year. That's why they have to cook up a new batch of influenza shots for people every year, because the influenza will be slightly different from year to year. But in this case, some type of mutation had taken place, which caused incredibly high mortality rates, and furthermore, was striking people not just at the extremes of the age range of the very old and the very young, and of course, those who were seriously ill, but it was killing many young people, especially people in their child-rearing years, let's say from late teens to early 30s. This is where some of the highest mortality rates occurred. My grandmother died of influenza at this time, and she was a very young woman. And her case was fairly typical of what was happening in populations. Now, what scientists have done is to try to understand what happened is that a few years ago, they dug up several bodies of people who had been buried in frozen tundra, with the idea that these victims of the influenza epidemic of 1918 would be virtually preserved with all of their organs in place. And that was true. You know, when they came out looking like, somebody who had been in a deep freeze for, they weren't all that cute. But their basic organs are there. Their tissue is fine for sampling and so forth. And they began testing, particularly the lung tissue, to try to find what had caused these incredibly high mortality rates. And the answer is, they don't know, even now. So we have the reality that even in 1918, 1919, when it looked like modern science was contributing to an environment in which pandemics would no longer threaten humanity, we discover that that's not true, and that even more than 7 decades later, we still haven't been able to figure out what was it about this particular strain of influenza that made it so deadly. So the threat remains. And we see that in the contemporary world. The current panic, there have been several, is over avian flu, which, of course, occurs in birds, especially poultry. Poultry, because our concern with poultry is that, of course, poultry is usually living in close proximity to human beings. And just as with the ancient world, with chickenpox, the fear is that this animal-borne disease will mutate and be able to survive successfully in human hosts on a large-scale basis and cause a pandemic. That danger, of course, has been accelerated by the process of globalization. If we take just the issue of air travel, and realize how many millions of people are in the air traveling just in a given week all across the world. Millions and millions of people are getting on planes and flying. At a minimum, in this country alone, hundreds of thousands of people fly outside of the country every week. You can be in Hong Kong yesterday, Boston today. So if the speed of transportation increased the threat of pandemic back in 1918 when we're talking about trains and steamships, that danger has increased exponentially with modern transportation and the fact that we are increasingly easing the process by which people can travel. In other words, making it simpler for people to move from one international region to another, trying to limit documentation and the other kinds of strains, and in an era when increasingly we are reducing the numbers of inoculations that people are required to have to travel in different parts of the world, because it's believed that, look, we've basically dealt with certain diseases. Most areas of the world are relatively free of some epidemic diseases from the past, so we don't need to be inoculating huge populations. But most of all, it's the speed at which people can travel. If there were to be an outbreak in any urban area, and I say this because urban areas are where you usually find commercial airports, it's quite conceivable that within a week the disease could be spread around half the world. It would just take the right combination of factors, a few people getting on planes at the right time, and you could have it in 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 countries within a week's time. Happy prospect. Now, of course, companies are working to develop effective vaccines that would deal with the threat of avian flu. But of course, you never know exactly what version of it would appear in human beings, and whether it could, as the influenza did in 1918, whether there could be some sudden mutation that would rapidly spread the disease. I mean, we're worried about avian flu, but quite frankly, there's no evidence to prove that traditional influenza, Asian influenza as it's often referred to, we like to blame it on other people, Spanish influenza, Asian influenza, whatever, it's not ours. Somebody else brought it here. But there's no reason to believe that the sort of typical flu that we experience every winter couldn't mutate in a given year, because that's exactly what the influenza did in 1918. And never mind avian flu, which we sort of have a handle on and people are at least tracking, but that you could have a sudden mutation and it could spread around the globe. And it doesn't necessarily have to be avian flu. The thing about avian flu is that until it actually effectively makes the transfer from animals or birds to human beings, it's really not that much of a danger. But traditional forms of flu, of course, revisit human populations every year. If that should happen, there would be no immediate vaccine. And probably the only answer, and this is in fact, this is what the U.S. government is currently planning on, is quarantine. To go back and do what they did during the Black Death. Now they probably won't wall people up in their houses. But short of that, they will simply shut everything down. And this is what happened in 1918, by the way, in the United States. They just started shutting everything down. Stores closed, schools closed, government offices closed, transportation systems, urban transportation systems were shut down. You just could not move because they wouldn't let you. In this case, they'd closed down, every airport that they could possibly close. And they just shut everything down for who knows how long. So even today, in the contemporary era where we talk about all the wonders of modern medicine, the fact is that probably if there is another pandemic of the sort that occurred in 1918, the solution would probably be the same one as existed in the early modern world, and that is simply to wall people off where they are until the epidemic subsides. Nice to know we're making progress. Okay. So, we've been looking at men and microbes. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense towards women, and just men as a, it's an alliteration, men and microbes, human beings and, disease. And how they have interacted, and especially how disease affects human history. In the ancient world, there were epidemic diseases, and they could have profound consequences. They certainly devastated the Roman Empire. There are those who will argue that one of the reasons for the decline of the Roman Empire was the impact of epidemic disease, such as the plague of Justinian. Of course, people also blame it on sunspots and God knows what else. But certainly epidemic disease could severely weaken state systems, do enormous harm to populations and economies in the ancient world. On the other hand, as we've seen, the relative isolation of even major state systems, whether in Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, their isolation from each other, the long distances, the fact that relatively few people traveled between such locations, meant that the effects of these epidemics were usually confined to relatively small areas. They were not going to circle the globe. They were not going to kill off all of the inhabitants of the world because there was simply no vectors, no means by which the disease could spread that far. They were simply going to, at some point the disease would spread out to areas where population levels were so thin that the disease simply would not be able to move very easily anymore. And that's what happened. So you could have terrible epidemics, but they were confined to relatively small spaces, at least when you look at it from a global perspective. And now, that changed in the early modern world. One of the key factors changing it was the rise of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, again, are precursors of the great trading empires that we're going to be looking at next time. They created this vast land-based empire from China all the way to Eastern Europe. By securing trade routes, overland routes, they allowed for the rapid movement of commercial goods over vast distances. And by doing so, they ensured the rapid spread of disease as well. If you can move goods and people over long distances, you can move disease as well. All it took was a climatic change, a cooling of the climate, a drying out of the regions in northern Asia, limiting water supplies for rats who began to travel south with their companions, the fleas. And suddenly, the plague, which had struck earlier generations, was going to spread again, but this time with far greater rapidity. It was going to be able to affect far larger populations much more quickly than had ever happened in the past, because these transportation systems and networks simply weren't that extensive. As I said, the Mongols marked the beginnings of what become the great trading empires, such as Spain, Portugal, the Ottoman Empire. And those empires are going to be built to a significant degree on long-distance oceanic trade, interoceanic travel. And that means yet another opportunity to spread disease. And in this case, one particular example, when the Europeans, specifically the Spanish, arrive in the New World, they encounter this relatively pristine population that had been living isolated from the worst of the pandemics for at least 12,000 years. And so when the disease starts to spread, when diseases, because there were multiple diseases, from smallpox to plague to influenza, they do form this invisible army that marches before Cortés and Pizzaro, and as we've seen, dramatically impacts the ability of the Aztecs and the Incas to resist the Spanish. And at the same time, it radically alters the Western Hemisphere, as it reduces the population by 90% and leads to the emergence of new population compositions, including Afro-Creoles and Mestizos. Even though we in the modern world like to think we've conquered many of these threats, thanks to medical science, we in fact know from the experience of the influenza epidemic or pandemic of 1918 and the threat that we now see on the horizon from avian flu, that in fact we're probably no more secure from pandemic than were the inhabitants of 13th century Europe. Now, beyond the collapse of population, the consequences of pandemic disease. In Europe, we saw the weakening of the Christian church as there is a die-off among its bureaucracy, priests and nuns, a weakening of feudalism as so many peasants die that those who remain do not necessarily have to remain under the control of local landowners. They can move off to find land that is now untilled because others have died. It actually saves the environment of Europe to a degree, because with far fewer Europeans, there'll be fewer of them to cut down trees, fewer of them to fill in swamplands and marshlands. There'll be less damage to the environment because there'll be fewer human beings to damage it. It also creates a power vacuum in the Mediterranean, as Genoa and the other cities, Italian cities that had dominated trade in the region, are now severely weakened. They were among the first to be devastated by the plague. And we'll see that has important consequences for the rise of the new trading empires next time. It encourages long-distance trade because merchants, seeing much of their market destroyed by the plague, go looking further afield to trade goods in order to maintain their businesses. So mass death isn't all that bad. So there's a silver lining in every cloud, even if you're not around to see it. In the Americas, these invisible armies of disease facilitated the conquest, made it easier for the Spanish to conquer the New World. They weren't the only factor, of course. I mentioned several others, but they were an important factor. Changes the population face of the Americas. Afro-Creoles, Mestizos coming in. The Afro-Creoles brought as slaves, of course, from Africa. Mestizos being the product of the intermingling of Spaniards and indigenous populations, whose survival rate, of course, would be much higher because they would inherit the immunity of their European parents. We see the emergence of new cultures, such as the Afro-Creole cultures of the Caribbean, but also the survival of older cultures, particularly the indigenous cultures of the Andean regions of South America. Changing economic institutions, particularly the emergence of the Hacienda, the great landed estate, which becomes a classic economic institution in Latin America's history. We'll see more of that when we look at Spain and the New World. What we've seen are a series of factors that were affecting the world roughly between 1200 and 1500. Climate change, the movement of nomadic peoples, the spread of epidemic disease, the creation of the Mongol Empire. All of these factors are interrelated. Mongols move in part because of climate change. The Mongols, when they create the empire, help spread disease. Disease helps Europeans spread their empires when it kills off much of the population of the Americas. All of these factors are coming together to start accelerating change in the world as it was. We are now entering the early modern age. The most critical development that will occur, that will mark this change, will be the emergence of the great trading empires, thing we're going to look at next. And they will further accelerate the process in which human society, human behavior, human thought patterns even, begin changing in significant ways and with ever greater rapidity. So what has been background in looking at the ancient world is now preamble as we see these changes affecting the pre-modern world and now opening the door to ever accelerating change and the modern age. We'll start looking at next time. Thank you.